I ended the first lecture in this series by describing and trying to account for the collapse of the European empires in the Americas, mostly in the Americas, in a half century from the mid-70s, 1770s to the mid-1820s. And this evening, I want to recount and try and explain the re-emergence of European empires in a new form in the second and third quarters of the 19th century and discuss how and why they expanded when there was little real desire, as I hope to show, on the part of European states for new overseas colonial possessions. This reluctance to re-embark on colonization by states and governments had a number of causes, I think. The economic imperatives that had underpinned the old pre-industrial European empires that I talked about last time had lost their power. Mercantilism, the idea of a monopoly of trade between the colonies and their mother state, the metropolis, had given way to a general acceptance of free trade, driven partly, as I sought to explain last time, by merchants in the colonies themselves. And the liberation of the Americas from colonial control was, to a degree, the consequence of this drive for greater freedom of trade by merchants in the Americas, both north and south. In the 1820s, European powers took the lesson and opened the colonies they still possessed to foreign ships from other states. British policy by the 1830s and 40s gradually established free trade as the basic principle of world economic exchange, though not without a struggle, as the debates over the Corn Laws and their repeal showed. In this era of free trade, European powers didn't really see the need to acquire colonies. The Vienna Peace Settlement in 1815, the Congress system of the 1820s, underlined the great powers' determination to avoid international conflicts in Europe. So these were no longer around to spill over, as they'd done in the 18th century, into colonial wars on other continents. Conversely, the European powers are also determined that colonial conflicts, should they arise, should be solved peacefully, just like conflicts within 19th century Europe. In any case, the major global colonial conflict between Britain and France had been resolved in favour of Britain, while the largest colonial empires, those of the Dutch, Spanish and Portuguese, had been largely destroyed or lost their rationale because of the end of mercantilism and the coming of the age of free trade. Free trade favoured above all the British, whose navy dominated the world's seas in the wake of the Battle of Trafalgar here, and continued to do so until very near the end of the century. British command of the ocean was pretty well absolute. By the mid-1870s, the Royal Navy consisted of more than 500 ships, with roughly half of these in active commission at any one time. 61 of these were ironclads, wooden vessels still being phased out in the 1870s. Steam-powered or partly steam-powered ships were already introduced in the 1820s. Development of screw-driven vessels in the following decade formed the basis for a huge expansion in numbers of these fast ocean-going ships that were no longer dependent on the vagaries of wind and weather. And the Royal Navy was far larger and more powerful than its nearest rivals, the French and American navies. Indeed, from the 1870s, it was official British policy to ensure that the Royal Navy's strength should be greater than that of any other two navies combined. So with such massive naval predominance, the British can control the access of other powers to other parts of the world. The British were the only power in a position to acquire and maintain a large-scale empire, and correspondingly, till the 1880s, they were pretty much the only European empire to possess one, the European state to possess one. And by this time, more than 80% of the world's goods were carried in British ships. The British almost completely dominated trade with Latin America, for example. So there was no obvious reason why they should seek to convert economic power there, or indeed anywhere else, into the annexation of territory. And for much of the century, there's no specific or explicit ideology of what came to be called imperialism, asserting the superiority of European civilization over others, or, in particular, justifying the acquisition of colonies as a matter of policy. And the function of such colonies that as remained also began to diminish. In the 18th century, for example, the transportation of slaves to the plantations of North and South America and the Caribbean had been a fundamental part of the trading relations of Europe with the Americas, helping the creation of major seaports like Liverpool, from where ships sailed to Africa with goods and money to buy slaves, with which they went to the Americas, allowing cotton, tobacco and sugar to be taken back to England. As I noted in my previous lecture, the slave trade fell foul of humanitarian, religious and rationalist ideas of human equality and human rights at the beginning of the 19th century. The massive slave revolt in Haiti illustrated to many land and plantation owners the dangers of the institution and the threat that mass discontent could pose to their interests. And in particular, the evangelical revival in Britain in the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought to slave-owning parts of the British Empire radical missionaries who soon began to champion slaves' rights. Thus, in Demerara, part of British Guiana, acquired by Britain from the Netherlands in 1815 as part of the peace settlement, the arrival of one John Smith, sent by the London Missionary Society 2 years later, soon sparked discontent as he began to fight plantation owners for the slaves' rights to attend chapel services and soon won the slaves' confidence. Ever since I've been in the colony, he wrote back to the Missionary Society, the slaves have been most grievously oppressed. A most immoderate quantity of work has very generally been exacted of them, not excepting women far advanced in pregnancy. When sick, they have commonly been neglected, ill-treated, or half-starved. Their punishments have been frequent and severe. Redress they have so seldom been able to obtain that many of them have long discontinued to seek it, even when they've been notoriously wronged. Smith encouraged the slaves to educate and improve themselves and made a number of them deacons of his chapel. Absentee plantation owners, including the father of the subsequent Prime Minister Gladstone, were assured by their agents on the ground that all was well. But in fact, conditions were so harsh, as Smith described them, that in 1823, 10,000 slaves in Demerara rose in a mass rebellion. They scored some initial successes. They forced colonial troops to retreat. The rebellion was soon repressed. And the whole episode, there's surprisingly little bloodshed. Most the slaves did to the owners or their agents were to imprison them in the stocks where they themselves had often been placed. An even larger uprising involving 60,000 slaves took place under similar circumstances in Barbados in 1831, where the central figure was the Baptist preacher and missionary William Knibb, who had been championing the slaves against the plantation managers and described slavery as one of the most odious monsters that ever disgraced the earth. In Bahia province in Brazil in 1835, there's a very different kind of slave revolt, directly inspired by the Haitian rebellion earlier in the century. The rebels actually carried pictures of Toussaint Louverture and the leaders of the Haitian uprising. And they were led by Muslim preachers who were able to mobilize slaves transported from Islamic states in West Africa. This is a rather more violent rebellion, and like all the others, it was put down with considerable force by the Brazilian army. It's not the only slave uprising in Brazil, it's the largest one. Well, all these revolts caused growing alarm among European colonists, plantation owners, governments. The Brazilian slave trade was ended shortly after the Great Revolt of 1835, while the British Anti-Slavery Society persuaded Parliament to abolish slavery in British-controlled parts of the world in this is the Brazilian slave revolt again, very violent episode there. This is the abolition of slavery in 1833, a law that came fully into effect in 1838. It took some years till it was followed in areas under the control of the East India Company, but everywhere in the middle decades of the century, including in the newly independent South American countries, slavery was formally abolished and international treaties were negotiated for the suppression of the slave trade. Trade with the West Indies remained important for the British, but it was gradually augmented, in some ways supplanted, by trade with the cotton-growing states of the southern USA and other parts of the world. The belief in the freedom of the individual went hand in hand in the end with advocacy of the freedom of trade. evangelical missionary societies, far from being the harbingers of imperialism at this time, played a key part in outlawing slavery. The growing threat of slave revolts reduced the resistance of slave owners and plantation managers to liberating the slaves. Now, the expansion of European overseas empires in the years from the end of the Napoleonic Wars to the beginning of the scramble for Africa came overwhelmingly as a result of choices faced by European nations as a result of developing situations in other parts of the world. Even where this seemed not to be the case, local events played an important role. One example here is the French annexation of Algeria in 1830. Now, Algeria is formally speaking part of the Ottoman Empire, but the autonomous governor of the province, the Dey of Algiers, was getting into financial difficulties because Algiers' main sources of wealth, which were slavery, kidnapping, and piracy, it was kind of Somalia of its day in some ways, but it was controlled by the Dey of Algiers, all of these were declining, partly because of the British interference. In 1816, for example, the British forced the Dey to surrender Christian slaves and all the money he'd received for ransoming Christian prisoners. You might just see the writing, the inscription at the bottom of Lord Exmouth's wonderful deed. In 1827, if you put up taxes, you couldn't really put up taxes to substitute for the income he got from piracy and slavery and kidnapping because the local people were too resistant to taxes. So in 1827, faced with financial ruin, the Dey asked the French to repay the money he'd lent them during the Napoleonic Wars. The French were borrowing money everywhere. And the French consul refused flatly to do this. So the Dey summoned him to his court, called him a wicked, faithless, idol-worshipping rascal, and struck him with a fly whisk. As you can see, a rather large fly whisk. Perhaps in Algiers they had rather large flies. So there he is, wielding it and struck him. It's probably larger than the actual one used in this French cartoon. The French press, of course, bayed for revenge for this insult. And Marseille and southern French traders saw the opportunity provided by this to get hold of Algiers for their own economic interests. But actually nothing happened immediately in 1827, apart from a naval blockade which had no effect. King Charles X was nervous about antagonizing the British, who did, after all, control the seas. But by 1830, the British government was preoccupied with domestic troubles, which eventually led to the 1832 Reform Act. Charles X also had very deep problems at home that would in fact lead in 1830 to his own being thrown off, his own deposition, being thrown off the throne later in the year. But he was backed by Metternich and the Holy Alliance, who thought the conquest of Algeria would make the French king popular and stave off liberal revolt at home. So the army, thirsting as they'd been since 1815 to relive the glories of the Napoleonic era, pulled out the late emperor's invasion plans from a bottom drawer somewhere in Paris, and Charles announced he was invading to avenge the grave insult of the fly whisk incident, and also incidentally bring piracy to an end and convert the Algerians to Christianity. 84 French ships conveyed 37,000 troops across the Mediterranean, set up a well-defended base camp. 35,000 Ottoman troops arrived on the 19th of June 1830, but the French were better armed with better guns, and some rather confused fighting actually routed them. As the French soldiers entered the Ottoman camp, they found 60 camels tethered there. They had no idea what they were or what they were used for, so they shot and ate them. It's not a dish one sees frequently in French restaurant menus. On the 5th of July, the Dey surrendered on the condition that the people's religion was respected, and the French duly occupied Algiers. Napoleon had triumphed once more, this time from beyond the grave. Well, needless to say, of course, the French did not keep their promises. They soon began turning mosques into churches, leading to resistance from this deeply Muslim country, led by the Sufi orders who'd already rebelled against the taxation demands of the Ottomans of the day. A young holy man, Abd al-Qadir, claimed descent from the Prophet Muhammad, emerged as a leader, proclaimed a jihad, a holy war, inflicted repeated defeats on the French. By the 1836, things had got so bad that Louis Philippe, now the monarch in the July monarchy, sent in Marshal Thomas Robert Bugeaud, who used his experience with guerrilla tactics in the Peninsular War in Spain in the earlier part of the century to push the rebels back. He razed their villages to the ground, thus introducing, incidentally, the Arab word razzia, scorched earth, to many European languages, and he beheaded all the Muslims taken prisoner. Victory finally came in 1847 when Abd al-Qadir surrendered and left for Damascus. A motley crew of settlers began to arrive from Europe, French aristocrats who were dismayed by the turn taken by political events in the homeland and wanted to build a kind of pre-1789 society in Algeria. There were Cistercian monks who built a monastery and a farm. There were ex-soldiers granted land at the end of their service. There were socialist disciples of Saint-Simon who wanted to build utopian communities. Later on, there were revolutionaries deported from France after the June 1848 uprising. And there were then Italians, Spaniards, Maltese, and many others, as in this contemporary cartoon. By the time of the Second Empire, the settlers had lost most of their original ideals and focused on opposing the rule of the military, whom they considered by now to be too pro-Arab. On the 24th of October 1870, the new Republican government in Paris passed a law giving Jews, it's a very old established Jewish community, more than about 2,000 years old, and settlers in Algeria French citizenship, but Arabs and Berbers continued to be excluded from full rights. A local Muslim leader, Bahaga el-Mahrani, declared a jihad again against the French, outraged that Jews had been placed above Muslims, and convinced, this is 1870, October, Franco-Prussian War, the French are being defeated, and thought this is the moment to attack, convinced that the Prussian victory was a sign of divine justice against the French. There he is, contemporary photograph. In 1868, French rule had also been a major factor in a famine in which perhaps 250,000 Algerians died. French propaganda made great play with the famine relief operation operated by the church in Algeria, but this too was a bitter cause of resentment. The famine in itself, this is only really, as it were, ate away at the edges of the famine and provided relief at the margins. 250,000 still died. 150,000 Muslims rose in Mahrani's support and began besieging the towns where the French and the settlers had retreated for safety. Within a short time, the revolt was defeated, but again with extraordinary violence. Together with the 1868 famine and the repression of the revolt, and many massacres committed by the French, around 1 million people, it's estimated, have died, about a third of the population. The French killed the leaders or sent them to the Pacific island of New Caledonia. They confiscated up to 500,000 hectares of Arab land. They restricted pilgrimages to Mecca to cut off Algeria from the rest of the Muslim world. They even classified Arabic as a foreign language. Muslim social and educational institutions were destroyed, and within a few years, the northern part of the country had been turned into 3 French départements, satisfying settler demands, while the southern part remained under military control. And all of this stored up, I think, some serious problems for the future. Algeria was a bit of an exception to the normal pattern of European colonial interest before 1818. More traditional patterns obtained in the rest of Africa, where 3 different interests intersected. First of these is trading, as it had been for centuries. As the slave trade declined and then came to an end, European trading bases began to deal in vegetable oils instead of slaves, processing African-grown groundnuts and palms for oil. But this created an intensified demand for slaves within Africa itself, so that the slave trade within sub-Saharan Africa continued well into the second half of the 19th century, providing labour for these new plantations. By around 1880, trading bases, mainly British and some French, were dotted all over the West African coast, and rivalry between them was clearly beginning to become a potential source of conflict. Their respective governments intervened to try and make them financially useful by charging customs duties, which in turn meant annexing new entry points to the continent to stop smuggling. So in 1850, for example, the British government acquired the remaining Danish forts on the coast. Lagos they got in 1861, the Dutch base of Elmina in 1872. The French acquired new posts on the coast of Senegal. There's a contemporary illustration here. So the possibility of these trading bases getting into trouble with African rulers and requiring military protection from the homeland increased as their numbers and influence grew. So that's one, trading bases spreading, growing in number, beginning to affect relations with the hinterland. And secondly, there are explorers. The rapidly growing prestige of science, scientific knowledge in the 19th century fueled and was also partly driven by the idea of exploration. The exploration of the solar system, the universe, exploration of the world of disease, infection, exploration of the basic constituents of matter, the material world, and not least, of course, the exploration of other parts of the globe. Funded by institutions like the Royal Geographical Society, it became the subject of massive popular enthusiasm. The growth of literacy and education, expansion of the newspaper industry, all of this grew into something like what we call nowadays media frenzy by the second half of the 19th century, the mid-19th century. And the search for the source of the River Nile became almost a public obsession in England, with the Royal Geographical Society funding the expedition by Burton and Speke in 1856, and another expedition by the self-funding Samuel Baker and his wife Florence in 1865. Here was an adventure story tailor-made to inflame the Victorian imagination. For Baker had spotted Florence, blonde and blue-eyed, while visiting the slave market in Vidin, in the Bulgarian part of the Ottoman Empire. He put in a bid, but he was outbid by the local pasha, so he bribed her keepers and ran away with her, getting married in Bucharest. Florence claimed to be a Hungarian aristocrat whose family had been killed in the 1848 revolution in Budapest when she was only 3 years of age. Her nurse had smuggled out to a refugee camp in Vidin, where she was adopted by an Armenian family who took her to the slave market to be sold and groomed for the harem. Not everyone believed these remarkable stories, probably wisely. But Baker himself also had an adventurous past. He studied engineering in Germany. He built railways in Romania, lived for a time in Ceylon, and then spent the 1860s in African exploration, accompanied everywhere, as in this picture, by Florence. In 1869, he managed to get himself made a major general in the Egyptian army and led a force of 1,700 freed convicts on an expedition to suppress the slave trade in the equatorial regions of the Upper Nile. Indeed, his successor in this post was General George Gordon of Khartoum fame. Baker was an enthusiastic big game hunter in Europe, Africa, and America. He published books in which he claimed to have killed wild boar armed only with a knife, though in this illustration it's not quite clear who's hunting whom, I guess. He was, in the end, knighted for his services to exploration. Queen Victoria refused to receive him at court because, as she observed correctly, if rather severely, he had been intimate with his wife before marriage. It's a case of we are not amused, I guess. So, as Baker's career shows, exploration had become a global activity. It's often carried out by men who themselves had a global background. It's the case, for example, by Paul du Chaillu, who claims to be the first European to see a live gorilla. And you can see, as soon as they saw it, what they did with it. Again, this is seen as a kind of big game hunting. This is in the 1850s. He brought quite a few preserved corpses and skeletons of gorillas back to France to exhibit. Chaillu was also the first European to observe pygmies, as recounted in his book, The Country of the Dwarfs. He described the hunt for them in rather similar terms to those in which he portrayed his hunt for the gorilla. The book in which he recounted his discoveries became an immediate bestseller and was influential in the development of racist classifications of humanity in the late 19th century. Here's Dr. Chaillu among the pygmies. Chaillu was actually born on the island of Réunion, or possibly in Paris, or, according to another story, in New Orleans. He was certainly educated by missionaries in the West African territory of Gabon, where his father was a French trader, and he began exploring the hinterland in the 1850s. He made a lot of money writing and lecturing about his experiences, presenting them in such sensational terms that they were widely disbelieved, or assumed to incorporate hunting stories he'd heard from African acquaintances. Chailloux kept chimpanzees as pets, and he relayed African legends about gorillas abducting women and taking them into the forests. And since the writer Edgar Rice Burroughs was familiar with the stories Chailloux wrote for children about his experiences, it's been argued inevitably that Chailloux was the model for Tarzan. The most important of these explorers in political terms was Henry Morton Stanley. Born in 1841 in Wales as John Rowlands, he was illegitimate, brought up in a workhouse. He sailed to New Orleans, jumped ship, found a job with a rich trader called Henry Stanley, who eventually adopted him. Henry Morton Stanley managed to fight on both sides in the American Civil War. Then he became a journalist, which led to his being imprisoned by the Ottomans, and then being engaged by the legendary editor of the New York Herald, James Gordon Bennett, from whom presumably the expression Gordon Bennett derives, to find the missing British missionary David Livingstone. Stanley with some scenes there, including finding Livingstone at the bottom right there. And it's what happened after this that gave him his real importance. The Herald commissioned him to trace the course of the river Congo from its source to the sea. Starting out with a company of 356, Stanley eventually arrived at the mouth, an extraordinary journey, with only 114 left, none of them European. Disease took its toll, but so too did Stanley's brutal discipline, which included frequent floggings of his bearers. As Burton wrote, Stanley shoots Negroes as if they were monkeys. The savage, Stanley wrote himself, only respects force, power, boldness, and decision. And not surprisingly, he is said to have been the model for the figure of Kurtz in Joseph Conrad's novella Heart of Darkness. On a subsequent expedition, one of his officers bought an 11-year-old African girl and gave her to cannibals to see how she was cooked and eaten, though it was only after he died of fever that Stanley found out what he'd done. So one can't assume that he approved, but it gives a sort of impression of the style of these expeditions. Stanley's knowledge of the Congo led to his being commissioned by King Leopold II of Belgium, who thought that possession of the Congo Basin would yield prestige for his country and profits for himself. Leopold's government wasn't interested in pursuing this idea. So the king set up a private company, wholly owned by himself, under the guise of an international exploration society, and he got Stanley to mount further expeditions to sign economic agreements with local African rulers, which Leopold then falsified to make it look as if they were ceding territory to his company. Stanley's expeditions constructed roads, which ironically then seemed to help the slave traders' business by making it easier for them to travel. His expeditions carried on to the early 1890s. They opened up lakes, mountains, huge tracts of territory to European knowledge. But they also laid the foundations for King Leopold's exploitation of the region, which I'll talk about in more detail in a later lecture in this series. And they naturally aroused alarm in the British and the French. The French sent another explorer, Pierre Brazza, to open up parts of the Congo Basin to French influence. As yet, all these interests in these areas were partly exploratory and partly economic. The French certainly wanted Brazza to express and further French economic interests in the Congo Basin. But the rivalries they're beginning to generate, which is a classic example, between European states would soon have major repercussions in the international arena, which I shall talk about in my next lecture in November. Stanley's famous meeting with David Livingstone generated massive publicity in Europe and America. And here we encounter the third influence I talked about. Besides traders and explorers, you have missionaries. Livingstone's fame, in fact, derived from his combination of scientific, religious, and moral interest in Africa. He was born in 1813, grew up in a strictly religious household, but also developed an interest in science. And he saw his life's work as trying to reconcile religion and science at a time when they seemed to be coming into conflict with one another. Livingstone trained in medicine, but he felt called to go to Africa as a missionary in 1841. Arriving as a missionary, he soon began exploring. Unlike, say, Stanley, who travelled with a huge train of bearers and massive supplies, Livingstone travelled light, only a few bearers, so he was not seen as a threat by local chiefs. But when he did lead a larger expedition, sponsored by the British government, to explore the Zambezi with a view to opening up to trade, he proved a poor organizer. His steamboat, seen here in a sketch, watercolour painting, his steamboat kept stopping because its paddle wheel kept being fouled by bodies thrown into the river by slave traders. "I'm prepared to go anywhere," Livingstone said defiantly in the face of these difficulties, "provided it be forward," one of his most famous statements. But he quarrelled with his assistants, most of whom resigned or were dismissed, and eventually the government recalled the expedition. Scientists had made a lot of discoveries, but they'd failed to find a navigable route along the Zambezi River. And similar problems dogged Livingstone's attempt to find the source of the Nile, though he did again map out many of the major geographical features, mountains, rivers, and lakes of the upper Zambezi region. And while he was doing this exploring, Livingstone also founded a number of mission schools and wasted few opportunities for religious conversion. Many years later, some of these schools gave an education to young men who became leaders of African nationalist movements, which is no doubt one reason why Livingstone has been remembered positively in independent Zambia. Is a collection of commemorative stamps. The reports he sent back to England continually stressed the need to combat the slave trade, which still existed, as I mentioned, in the eras he went through. But again, of course, ironically, as his expeditions got smaller, he came to depend on the help of African slave traders to make them work. In his last expedition, he's often ill. But after his death in 1873, his bearers carried his decomposing body for 1,000 miles to the coast for return to Britain. And the combination of courage and piety, science and faith, determination in the face of adversity, made Livingstone's life an inspiration for Victorians, helped by Stanley's journalism. Livingstone became a legend. But, as I hope to show in my next lecture, his actions laid the foundations for later British territorial expansion, though he himself had no interest in it at all. Britain's lack of interest in formal colonization in the mid-Victorian era was particularly clear in southern Africa, where the government tried in vain to restrict the northward movement of Boer settlers from the Cape, beginning with the Great Trek in 1830-36. Here you have Dutch settlers who moved into the Cape much earlier on and in the 17th, 18th centuries, and had gradually colonized farmland, colonized many areas of the moving northwards, and here in 1836 moved northwards in large numbers, considerably worrying the British. So London veered between annexing areas settled by the Boers, who were, after all, technically British subjects, and allowing them autonomy. So the Transvaal, for example, was recognized as a free state in 1852. Then it was annexed in 1877, when the British government changed its mind, and then it was given autonomy again in 1881. And this toing and froing, this indecision, again, was to have major repercussions at the end of the century. In India, too, expansion was largely unplanned by Britain. It occurred particularly on the initiative of Governor-General Lord Dalhousie, appointed in 1848. Dalhousie thought Indian-controlled states were inefficient and that income from the East India Company, which remember this is still in control of these areas, the British government has only got a partial role in organising some aspects of the administration. So Dalhousie thought that there'd be greater profits and income for the company if he annexed inefficiently ruled Indian areas. Disorder in the Punjab, following the death of its ruler, indeed creator, Ranjit Singh in 1839, drew the British in. It was annexed after fighting in 1849 alongside neighbouring Sindh in 1843. And both controlled access to Afghanistan, where a disastrous British expedition had failed to establish any kind of control in 1842. Indeed, 16,000 men went in the British forces, all but one were annihilated. A survivor, Dr. William Brydon, seen here in Lady Elizabeth Butler's painting The Remnants of an Army Arriving Half Dead at Jalalabad. Personally, I always feel it's a mistake to invade Afghanistan. You always come off worse, but certainly here, this ill-fated expedition, by far the biggest defeat of any European power, even including that of the Russians in the 20th century. This rapid expansion of British India in the 1840s, and especially the mid-50s, when many parts of North India were taken under British rule, along with Lower Burma, where Dalhousie acted in 1852 to protect British trading interests, all of this, these annexations began to create serious tensions and resentments. Indians from these areas in the army feared that they would lose their local privileges and have to pay higher taxes. The arrival of missionaries in the newly annexed areas sparked fears of forced conversion to Christianity. Territorial expansion meant that Indian troops were now expected to serve away from their homeland without additional pay, even in such faraway areas as Burma or even China. British control was precarious. In the mid-century, the subcontinent had a population of around 200 million. Clearly, it was not going to be a colony of settlement for the British, like, say, Australia or Canada. It wasn't going to be converted to Christianity. It was not going to be culturally assimilated into European ways of living. But it did yield massive revenues, which were used to sustain a very large army recruited from the Indian population, so-called sepoys, which reached a number of 200,000 in 1857, along with 16,000 European troops with British officers in separate regiments. The resentments, already building up amongst the sepoys, boiled over when a new model of rifle was introduced with pre-greased paper cartridges that had to be bitten open to release the powder. The tallow used to grease them was made either from beef fat, offending Hindus, or pork fat, offending Muslims. The sepoys refused to do this. Attempts to discipline them led to open rebellion, hence the term Indian mutiny. It began as a mutiny amongst Indian soldiers. Soon there's open war, with some key Indian states, as rulers resented their loss of power and British interference with Hindu customs, throwing off British control and joining the uprising. Some Indian states remained loyal. In some areas, the revolt took on a distinctly nationalistic character, though in the end, the diverse motives of the rebels, and the fact that many areas stayed calm and kept their distance from the uprising, makes it a bit difficult to describe it, as it sometimes is, as a concerted war or first war of independence. At any rate, the British were driven back into forts and besieged by the Indian troops. And numerous massacres, most notably at Kanpur, which inflamed public opinion in Britain and fueled a massive wave of revenge as British forces regained the initiative and began punishing the rebels, shooting and hanging them in huge numbers, or using a traditional Mughal punishment of firing them from the mouths of cannon. This was a traumatic episode for the British as well as for India, and the British government wound up the British East India Company in 1858 and replaced it by direct government control, the beginning of the British Raj. The number of British troops in India was virtually doubled, sepoy recruitment confined now to more loyal areas in the north. And all this is funded by a new and more acceptable taxation system based particularly on land as well as on excise duties. A reserve system meant that the army could be expanded quickly when deemed necessary, and it proved a major resource in, for example, the First World War. This establishment of control over India meant that India became, among other things, a centre for the expansion of British trade in the East, which then on occasion led to further acquisitions. I've already mentioned Burma, but then the British government control was soon extended over the Malayan Peninsula, where local states were forced to accept British informal control in 1873 in an attempt to protect trade with China against piracy. And piracy and the need to control it was also a major factor in prompting the Dutch to extend their control over Indonesia in the 1850s. So, like a lot of other developments of this sort across the globe in this period, the middle of the 19th century, this expansion was somewhat piecemeal and not centrally planned. You could say the same of the activities of the French in Indochina, where Napoleon III sent troops to impose religious toleration at the end of the 1850s, after some years during which every now and then French missionaries had been killed. Local French officials argued that further expansion was necessary to protect missions, and also, and here they do go together, trading interests. The clashes with local and regional powers. By the 1890s, France is left in full occupation of the entire Indochinese peninsula after, apart from Siam, after capturing the key fort of Hung Hua in 1884, this contemporary illustration. So in all these examples, it's local European officials, it's merchants, it's missionaries who put pressure on metropolitan governments, not the other way around. Strongest of all is the pressure coming from European settlers, South Africa, also Australia. As the free European population of Australia grew, traders, whalers and sealers began to move eastwards into the Pacific. So there is kind of what some people have called sub-imperialisms. You have settlers in various parts of the globe come from Europe, then began to expand their interests outwards. And since they're subjects of the metropolitan country, that begins to draw the metropolitan centres in as well. So by the 1830s, Australian settlers are trading guns and liquor with the Maoris in New Zealand, which again began to lead to clashes and growing disorder. Above all, wars between the different tribes of Maoris, which went on for quite a long time. Edward Gibbon Wakefield carried out what he called a systematic colonisation of South Australia by bringing over large numbers of European settlers, set sail with a similarly considerable number of emigrants for New Zealand, prompting the British government to declare British sovereignty in 1840 to provide some kind of order and protection for them. The Treaty of Waitangi, signed in 1840, the same year, was supposed to guarantee Maori land rights, but settlers perhaps inevitably ignored it. A series of wars, small-scale conflicts began, lasting all the way up to the 1870s. And in these small-scale wars, the British and the settlers were unable to defeat the Maoris, who adopted what one might call now as guerrilla tactics, I guess. European settlers outnumbered them by the 1860s, but a kind of stalemate, an uneasy truce was the end result. The Maoris were pushed out to the edge of European settlement in New Zealand, but defended their interests with some success in the areas where they were. And from there, European traders fanned out even further into the Pacific, looking for coconut oil or much coveted bird droppings, guano, a fertilizer, incredibly rich fertilizer for European farming. And they too began to kidnap Pacific Islanders for forced labour on sugar plantations in Queensland, so-called blackbirding. The British Navy tried to stop this trade, as in this incident recorded in 1869, where the Navy stopped a blackbirding vessel and is rescuing the kidnapped people from the hold. Clashes with Polynesian states led to the usual process of annexation. What we needed was a few Europeans to be killed, and then governments would feel obliged to defend their interests by moving in. So it includes Fiji, Samoa, which is divided between Britain, Germany, USA, and other island groups, though some, like Tonga, managed for the moment to resist annexation. So what's happening is still led by trade, and with a certain amount of missionary activity. Exploration provides a small amount of driving force, but trade is still what European governments are really looking for. Their imperatives are still economic. Increasingly, however, European governments felt obliged to come in when trading interests came under threat. China is a classic example. The Chinese Empire restricted entry to European goods while exporting large quantities of goods to the West, above all, of course, tea. To redress the balance, the East India Company smuggled increasing quantities of Indian-produced opium into China, starting already in the 18th century. In 1838, not for the first time, the Chinese Empire intervened to stop the trade and destroy its products. British ships were boarded in international waters. Their cargoes of opium were seized and destroyed. British merchants were blockaded in their factories and starved of food till they agreed to hand over the opium. In retaliation for this interference with free trade, as they saw it, the British sent a large force from India, still of course under control of the company, which seized Canton. In 1842, the British acquired Hong Kong and opened 4 other ports for legitimate trade, as they saw it. The USA and France soon got their treaty ports too. So here, freedom of trade, again, is the key thing for the Europeans, though what they were trading was extremely, was not the most, as it were, clean and useful of goods. Well, of course, the Chinese Empire was unhappy with these concessions. Conflict broke out again, leading to an Anglo-French force of 18,000 marching on Beijing in 1816. Here's a scene for the conflict at Guangzhou. Members of delegations sent to negotiate with the Chinese were arrested and tortured to death. In retaliation, the Europeans destroyed the old summer palace and forced the Chinese to open 10 new treaty ports, to pay a large indemnity, and to agree to the opium trade so long as it could be regulated. It's a key moment in the decline of Imperial China, though hardly a glorious one for the Europeans. Gladstone, indeed, condemned the first opium war as unjust and iniquitous, and the trade in the drug as infamous, but his protests, unlike many of his other protests, had little effect. Chinese weakness also opened up the way for Russian expansion in Asia. Now, we don't often think of Russia as a major colonial power, but in the course of the 19th century, settlers and traders moved eastwards, across Siberia, and further south as well. And local or regional officials again began acting on their own initiative to conclude treaties with local states or neighboring powers. Settlers from Russia on the Central Asian steppe were threatened by the unstable but powerful Muslim states of Khiva, Bukhara, and Kokand. So the Russian government forces gradually moved into these areas, turning the first 2 of these states into protectorates, incorporating the 3rd into a new province. More direct, by the end of the 1870s, Russia controlled all of Central Asia to the increasing alarm of the British. You can see the annexations with the dates there in the box at the top left-hand corner of this continual expansion eastwards and southeastwards, reaching the borders of Afghanistan and sparking what Victorians in Britain called the Great Game in Afghanistan. And, of course, in British eyes, beginning to threaten India. Still, a more direct interest to St. Petersburg was the securing of access to the Pacific. The province of Amur was seized from the Chinese. In 1858, the Chinese accepted this as a fait accompli. And Sakhalin Island was occupied, bringing the Russians up against Japan. You just see it on the far right hand of the map there. Eastward expansion even brought Russians across the Bering Straits into North America. Here's a contemporary map of Russian America. In the 18th century, Russian fur traders hunted and traded in Alaska, which is what we know this area is now, in increasing numbers, leading to armed conflicts with the local Native American tribes. were soon devastated by diseases brought across by traders from the Eurasian continent. As I explained in my last lecture, European diseases massively affected Native Americans right through North and South America, but this is a relatively isolated area, and they'd remained immune until the 18th century. But by the early 1800s, the Russian-American Company, a sort of local equivalent to the East India Company, had taken control of most of this trade. Russian Orthodox missionaries moved in, giving negative publicity to the brutal methods used by the traders to subdue the Native American population. Here again, there's clashes between missionaries and traders. By the middle of the century, 19th century, otters, beavers, and other fur-bearing animals, of the main economic interests of Russia here, had been hunted to near extinction. Also, there's competition for the Hudson's Bay Company, proving increasingly intrusive. The cost of communication across thousands of miles from Moscow right across the Bering Sea, the Bering Straits, was just proving impossible. What the Russians did was to decide to sell Alaska. There's never more than about 700 or 800 Russians there, most of all in the two coastal towns. 1867, the Russian government offered it to the USA for 2 cents an acre, an act that Native Americans there claimed they were not entitled. Here's the sale, photograph recorded for posterity. Native Americans claimed they weren't, because the Russians weren't entitled to sell. It was their land, and this dispute over this ran on until the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act of 1971. The Russia never properly colonized Alaska, in other words, but it did colonize Siberia, using it famously as a destination for convicts, especially after the opening up of silver and salt mines in the 18th century. 865,000 convicts were transported to Siberia in the 19th century. Some areas, like Sakhalin Island, contained more convicts than settlers. Transportation is a convenient substitute for imprisonment in a number of European states in an era when there's no purpose-built prisons, populations are growing, property offences increasing in number, educated opinion turning against the harsh corporal punishments and widespread use of the death penalty of the early modern period. For much of the 18th century, the British transported convicts to America. When this became impossible after 1776, they turned to Australia. By the 1820s, some 3,000 were being transported every year. By the 1840s, the number of private settlers had grown. They began objecting to the continual arrival of convicts. The harsh and brutal convict regime aroused widespread criticism in Britain. A report of 1835 led to convicts being rewarded by staged emancipation in Australia under a new system of probation. Here's a cartoon of convicts leaving their distraught families and being shipped off to Australia. Prison reform in Britain led to the building of model prisons like Pentonville and provided an easier and less controversial alternative to transportation, which declined in the 1850s and came to an end in 1867. Ironically, this is just the period when transportation from France actually began. In 1852, Napoleon III's government established a penal colony on Devil's Island in French Guiana, an unhealthy, brutal, often fatal prison through which 80,000 prisoners passed until it was closed down in 1946. Nowadays it welcomes more than 50,000 tourists every year. Meanwhile, political prisoners, including more than 4,000 arrested in the Paris Commune uprising of 1871, and thousands more taken prisoner in the Algerian uprising of that same year, were sent to New Caledonia, as I mentioned earlier, through which, again, some 20,000 convicts, most of them ordinary non-political offenders, passed by the time it was closed down in 1897. Even some German states sent offenders abroad, with the Kingdom of Hanover, for example, offering free passage to America to convicts as an alternative to a costly term of imprisonment, and issuing them with false passports and fake names if they agreed, so the Americans wouldn't know about it. This was, in the end, perhaps not a particularly important aspect of European colonization, though it certainly attracted a lot of attention. Throughout the period I've been discussing today, European priorities are always really, in the end, economic. The experience of colonial revolutions and wars of independence since the mid-18th century made European states reluctant to acquire new colonial possessions. Even in 1860, many parts of the globe, especially in Africa, were still uncolonized. But the drastically changed balance of power between Europe and other parts of the world, following on the development of industry, the military reorganization of European states in the wars of the late 18th, early 19th centuries, the beginnings of decline and disintegration of some of the great non-European empires, the Ottoman, Mughal, and Chinese empires in particular. All of these things made it easy for European states to gain territory overseas. The imperative here was, in the end, trade, not exclusive mercantilist trade, but the opening up of new markets in a world of free trade dominated by British maritime supremacy. There's no ideological drive to acquire territory, but again and again, the disruptive effects of European trade, aided and abetted, as it were, by exploration, missionary activity, the disruptive effects of all this on indigenous societies and political systems caused conflict and led European states to recover their prestige, secure their economic interests by intervening, in many cases leading to outright annexation, or at the very least, behind-the-scenes control. The whole process is haphazard. It's no idea that the colonial and imperial policy would be governed, for example, by international agreements. But in 1880, all this is about to change, as we'll see in my next lecture on the 22nd of November. Thank you very much.